We're going to continue to work with our code, and we're going to be modifying it and adding some more enhancements. But before we begin in this section of the course, we're going to look at the existing code that we have, and we're going to reorganize it slightly. Reorganizing your code can be referred to as refactoring, and this is essentially the process of restructuring existing computer code without changing the external behavior. Normally, when you refactor, it's going to improve the non-functional attributes of your code. So for us, we're going to make our code a little bit neater and a little easier to read, as well as consolidate it down. So what we had done in the last exercise is we had some buttons and we had IDs assigned to the buttons. In our script file, we had created variables with the names of those buttons, and we're using the document.getElementById to go ahead and target that button. And then we were adding the event listener and adding a click event, and then we're going to go ahead and run our various methods that we want to have happen. So that went ahead and solved the problem of displaying our to-dos and toggling all of the to-dos to be completed or not. We're going to still keep the same functionality, but we are going to refactor our code a little bit so that we can consolidate some of the code and just keep it a little tidier with the project that we're working on now. It is worth pointing out that even though we're going to be restructuring this is just another method of accomplishing the same sort of goals. So it's not to say that this is a better method than what we have right now. It's just an alternate method that I want to show you and that we're going to be using now, just in the interest of keeping our code a little bit more tidy and so that we can continue to work a little bit more with objects, which is what we were doing earlier in our application. So currently, with these buttons that we had added and with the code with the add event listeners, we have not a ton of extra code, but because we're going to ultimately want to add some more elements, we will end up with a lot more code. So I'm going to show you another way of writing this code where it just doesn't need to be quite as verbose, and we can consolidate things down a little bit and just keep it a little tidier. So now what we're going to do is we're going to create buttons for each of the methods that we have on our to-do list object. So in this section of the course, we're going to ultimately be creating buttons for each of the methods that we have on our to-do list object. But this is going to add some complexity, so we're going to refactor our code in the interest of making a shortcut, so to speak. So what we'll do is in the HTML file, for now I'm going to keep the existing buttons, but we're going to create some new buttons. And this is just so that I can show you the different techniques. So we're going to have a button. We're going to add the onClick attribute. And for right now, we'll just leave the onClick attribute empty. And then I'm going to go ahead and put some text here. So we'll put display my to-dos. I'll just copy this text right here. And then I'm going to make another button. And again, I'm just going to leave my onClick event empty right now. And then this will be the button to toggle all the to-dos completed or not. So inside of the quotes is ultimately going to go the function that we want to run, but we haven't actually created that yet. So what we'll do is we'll just leave this blank and we'll come fill it in after we augment our JavaScript. So back in my JavaScript file, what we want to do is we want to run the functions that we had created earlier when the buttons are clicked, but we don't have access from the HTML to those functions. So in our JavaScript file, we're going to create a new object. So down here at the bottom, I'm going to create a new object, and I'm going to call my object handlers. And we want the methods on this object to handle different events. So that's why I'm using this name. So we're going to put all of the methods that handle different events inside of this object. And in this way, we can kind of keep our code a little tidier. So I have my new handlers object, and we're going to start off by creating our properties. So the first property is going to be display TDs. And I'm going to use my colon, and I'm going to specify that I want to run a function. So this should look familiar to you because it's pretty much what we were doing earlier on in our course. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to call the method that I want to run. So the first one is going to be my TD list dot display TDs. And then I want to create a second property So I'll put a comma here, and our next one is going to be our tg_all. And again, we're going to run a function, and then we'll add on the methods that we want to run. So here we're going to do our td_list, and we'll call the tg_all method. And that is pretty much it. So as you can see, what we're doing is we're consolidating all of this code down into this code right here. And I'm just going to leave all of the code present for right now. We do need to go and augment our HTML. So back in the HTML, on the value for the onClick attribute, I'm going to write handlers, which is of course the name of our object, handlers. And then I'm going to put dot, and I'll specify the name of the property that I want to run. And so on my second button, this one is just going to be handlers.tg_all, and that's it. So if we save now and we go out to the browser, here's our page. If I refresh, I'm going to have two sets of buttons. So remember, the first set of buttons is using the add event listener, and then the second set of buttons should be functionally the same, but the code is going to be different. So if I click display my to-dos, it says you have nothing to do. Same as the button with the add event listener. Let's go ahead and let's add a couple of items onto our to-do list. And I'll just add on one more item. So I have a couple in here. So if I click display my to-dos, it's going to list both of the to-dos, same as the button with the add event listener. And if we go ahead and click our new toggle all to-dos completed or not, you can see that it's going to identify these as being completed. Same as if I click the add event listener method of showing those. And remember that this button is a toggle. So if I click it, it first removed the completed indicator, and then when I clicked it again, it showed it. So if I click this button, they're going to show up as being incomplete. So all of the buttons are going to work in the same way. I just want you to compare the code that we have. Here, the code in the HTML is fairly similar. It's maybe a tiny bit more letters and characters, but not much in the HTML. And certainly you can see inside of the JavaScript file that the object method of incorporating this code is a lot more consolidated than what we had up here with our add event listeners. So our code is not quite as complex. It's a little neater. When we organize the handlers onto an object, there's no repetition of anything that's happening as it was above. And as we add functionality so that the rest of our methods can be called, everything is going to be incorporated into our handlers object. So that will help consolidate everything. In the HTML, this is a little bit more descriptive too. Right now we just have an ID, but here we know that the button is using the onClick event, and then the value is specifying what's going to happen. So it does seem like it's a little bit more descriptive as to what's happening. Now, as I mentioned before, both of these methods are valid. They both work fine. They do the same thing. Functionality-wise, they all work the same way. You just need to kind of decide which one seems best for your application. And sometimes that's not really completely clear, especially to someone who's kind of new to JavaScript. So you might need to experiment. You might need to try different things. We're going to be using the onClick attribute now because it works better for our application right now. OnClick is a more specific use case. It can only handle one event, only the click. It might not be the first choice that you think of, and a lot of people encourage coders to just use the add event listener. It seems to be the more popular choice. And while that can be true, because the add event listener is more flexible, it's not as strict as onClick, it can handle any types of events, it can handle multiple event listeners on one element. So in a lot of cases, it is more flexible, but for right now, we can be more concise by using the object method. So I'm going to actually select the add event listener code and just delete it from my JavaScript. And in my HTML, I'm going to delete the two buttons with the IDs, and we'll just keep the buttons that have the onClick attribute. So if we go back into our code and we refresh, we're just going to end up with the two buttons. So these are going to be using the new code that we just created, and we'll be working forward utilizing this code.